And we're live. Take it away, Cassie.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Cassie Schwerner. I'm the Senior Vice President of National Partnerships for the Schott Foundation. And first, I just want to welcome everyone to another very special installment of our Schott Foundation's Grassroots Education webinar series. Our webinars are really an opportunity for you to engage with movement, policy, and philanthropic leaders, really to reflect on our progress, our stories, and discuss the work ahead, which is exactly what we want to do in today's webinar. So just a little bit about the Schott Foundation. Most of you know us, but for those who don't, the Schott Foundation is a public education fund that works to accelerate advocacy by helping to build and anchor and support broad-based movements led by the most impacted, including students, parents, teachers, educators, and other community members. So before we begin, I'm just going to share a few reminders. One is that we're going to leave time at the end, as we always do, for your questions, but we're also going to pause because we're going to talk about the framework of the Loving Cities Index, as well as some of the data. So we're going to pause after the framework for questions. So the way you ask questions in this format is by going to the chat box on your screen, and you can be sending in those questions through the chat box, and our team members will share those, and we can pose those questions as they come through. The other way to do it is through our Twitter handle at Schott Foundation, or at Schott Found. That's one word, SCHOTT Found, FOUND. And you can also follow the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag GrassrootsEd, ED, GrassrootsED. So those are the various ways to ask your questions when you have them. And we will be sure at the end to leave time for those questions. I'm not going to do introductions, but joining us today are the President and CEO of the Schott Foundation, Dr. John Jackson. So John will start out talking about our framework, and then after that, we'll hear from Allison Brown, who has been a consultant with us at the Schott Foundation and working for Community Wealth Partners. Allison's worked with us on the overall framework and data collection for the last year and is now a national expert on healthy living and learning communities. So we're glad to have both of them. And then I also just want to make sure that we do a special thank you. Many of you on this call have indirectly or directly contributed to this work of the Loving Cities Index through your work with community schools, with the We Choose campaign, fighting the school to prison pipeline, even working on campaigns like Invest, Divest. So all of that has really influenced our thinking as we've worked with you over the 25 years really of the Schott Foundation's history. So thank you in advance to all the hard work that you, especially the organizers and advocates, have done. So what we're going to do is I'm going to turn it over to John. John's going to share the framework for the Loving Cities Index, which I think folks know. We launched the index last week, and you can see it on the website www.lovingcitiesindex, or it's actually www.lovingcities. That's where to find it. And then, so we launched it last week, and John's going to share the framework, and then we're going to pause if you have some questions. And then Allison's going to share some of the data, and then we'll wrap up with a conclusion and some conversation questions from you all. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to John. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Cassie, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Good afternoon. As Cassie mentioned, for over 25 years, the Schott Foundation has worked towards fulfilling our mission of building broad-based movements to provide all students a fair and substantive opportunity to learn. And that work, in many respects, has taken us into doing some of the things that are necessary to bring about systemic change. Narrative change work, policy, addressing systemic policy proposals, convening cross-sector stakeholders, accelerating local campaigns, and education equity and social justice campaigns. And as racism and hate continues to dominate the national dialogue, we thought that it was important to release this Loving Cities Index, recognizing fully that throughout time there has been a consistent national dialogue around closing the achievement gap, primarily through an intense focus on standards, accountability, and tests. We recognize that this approach has virtually ignored the needs to address the broader student living opportunity gaps, as well as the learning opportunity gaps that create the types of racial disparities that we see in our educational systems and our living systems across the country. We recognize that local policies and practices throughout America's history have been rooted in implicit racial bias at best, and explicit racism and hate at worst. So our goal here is to work toward creating the types of healthy living and learning communities that provide all students a fair and substantive opportunity to learn, an opportunity to thrive. Our goal is, through the Loving Cities Index, is not to simply spread love. Although if that happens, that's great. However, we recognize that love is an action word. And in fact, we recognize when we call for loving cities, that loving cities have systems of policies and practices that offer care, stability, commitment, and capacity for all children, regardless of race, gender, or socioeconomic status. So it's not simply about highlighting the assessments or the standards that our young people must meet, but it is very much about identifying the supports that are necessary, because we clearly know now that it takes both a healthy living and learning environment to provide all students an opportunity to learn. In fact, for decades, parents, students, and advocates in communities have said this. And the data and the evidence is clear now that parental income remains the #1 predictor of student outcome. So clearly we are in a space now that we recognize that it takes a healthy living and learning environment to provide all students a fair and substantive opportunity to learn. We're in a space where it's necessary to close the opportunity gaps, to close the achievement gaps. So through the Loving Cities Index, we really highlight and challenge 3 points. First, that it's time to transition from a standards-based reform agenda to a supports-based reform agenda. Secondly, we challenge the notion that we can close the achievement gap and even more the opportunity gap by only critiquing what happens in the learning space, what happens with educators, students, and parents. But in fact, it takes addressing other larger cross-sector issues in order to address those gaps. And lastly, as we know that this work is about closing opportunity gap, in order to close opportunity gaps, it's about building relationships and cross-sector relationships. We can no longer work in silos because our young people don't live in silos. We can no longer in philanthropy just work in our portfolios because young people don't clearly live in portfolios. But we've got to build the types of cross-sector partnerships and relationships to provide all students an opportunity to learn. And if it's about relationships, we need to use language that is important in relationships. And as I've gone across the country and as we've done this work at the Schott Foundation, we hear parents ask the question, does this system care about my child? Is this system committed to my child? And it's about those types of relationship terms that we need to bring into the discourse. Because it's about building loving relationships. And I don't know about you, but I've never had a loved one lean over to me and say, I love the way you assess me, or you had me at accountability. But the very nature of the conversation is around care, stability, commitment, and capacity. So those are the domains that we used in the Loving Cities report to determine whether or not a city is providing the healthy living supports and the healthy learning supports. As you see on the screen today, it outlines the 4 domains that we dropped the 24 indicators in to measure the supports that cities are providing. When we talk about care, we talk about access to health resources and physical the environmental and foster physical and mental development supports. When we talk about stability, we're talking about community infrastructure supports and policies that foster physical and financial security. When we talk about commitment, we're talking about school policies and practices that foster the unique types of potential in each student. And when we talk about capacity, we're talking about financial policies. Are there the adequate resources that are necessary to provide students a fair and substantive opportunity to learn? And these are data that we look at not just from a perspective of looking at the static data points, looking at the current climate, but we also want to look at the supports to manipulate the current climate. So there are two types of data that we look at: thermometer indicators, and we classify thermometer indicators as indicators that provide some insight on the existing climate, much in the same way that a thermometer does. It tells you what the temperature is, but it doesn't necessarily tell you, it's not strong enough to tell you how to change the temperature. So to do that, we need thermostat data points. And the majority of the data that we look at today is too often thermometer data points. But the thermostat data points are the data points that track access to the critical supports and set the temperature for the climate. And much in the same way in your home, when you adjust the thermostat, you can adjust it by manipulating it in such a way to the ideal, to form the ideal climate. We have to do, and we're challenging cities to do the same thing relative to the supports that they're offering to address a host of opportunity gaps. So in this Loving Cities report, you will find a intense focus on the supports that are available in cities who are a part of the index. So if we can go just a little deeper on the types of supports, that the indicators that we look at in each of the domains. So if we look at care, we're talking about care indicators like prenatal health, health insurance, in-school support staff, access to parks, clean air, mental health, and healthy foods. When we talk about stability, we're talking about public transportation, youth safety, banking, access to affordable housing, which is an education issue, access to livable wages, and civic participation. These are the key care and stability indicators that are important to ensure that young people live in a healthy living environment. Likewise, as we look at ensuring that they have access to a healthy learning environment, we look at commitment indicators like preschool suspension alternatives, K through 12 expulsion alternatives, K through 12 suspension alternative, access to early childhood education, and anti-bullying initiatives. And on the capacity side, we look at indicators like access to gifted K through 12 curricula, experienced teacher, advanced high school curricula, and economically integrated schools. These are the types of supports that we know are significant and important to provide students a fair and substantive opportunity to learn. So as I mentioned, our goal with this effort is to enroll and engage over 50 cities over the next 5 years. We started the process with 10 cities, and the 10 cities are the 10 cities that you see listed here. The way that we engage these 10 cities, some of the cities have been working through cross-sector partnerships through a number of years, and they've seen some level of progress. Let me start by saying this, that there isn't a high poverty, high minority city that we've been able to identify that is providing all of the supports that are necessary to provide all students, regardless of race or ethnicity or gender or socioeconomic status, the supports that they need to have a fair and substantive opportunity to learn. That's the work that has to be done. Yet in the group of cities that you see here, there are some cities that have been working through cross-sector tables, and you will see and hear about some of the progress. There are other cities that, because of the political relevance of the city, we thought that it was important to engage and assess the supports that are available to students in those cities as a way to give a nudge. Even in those cities that are most challenged, we were able to find that there are some things that are working very well. And this is an effort to highlight. Through this effort, this is not a gotcha moment. It's not about ranking the leaders or laggers, but it is about engaging and enrolling the types of partnerships, the types of cross-sector tables, and quite frankly, the types of loving partners that are going to be necessary to ensure that our young people grow up in loving systems from birth. So rather than using a ranking approach, we would like to consider this much in the same way as the LEED's building standards, a way to highlight where cities are at this point. You may be at a gold level, you may be at a bronze level, but also provide some aspirational information to help cities move up the ladder in such a way where we can ensure at a national level that we're changing the national tone. Because while we're in this unique political moment right now, we recognize that a new day is coming. And in that new day, we want to present a new frame, a new effort for addressing the supports that cities and states need, a new relationship between the federal government and states, but more importantly, a new message for our young people, that our parents are not failures, our schools are not failures, and definitely they are not failures. And our goal is to ensure that they grow up in a loving system that provides them an opportunity to learn from birth. So I'll stop there before we go into the next portion of our presentation.
Great, thanks, John. There have been a number of questions that have come in. A few of your questions are about the data, so I'm going to hold those until Allie presents more on the data. But John, a couple questions that I'd love to hear your perspective on. One is about the court case that we're hearing today at the Supreme Court around teachers' unions, the Janus case. And so some examples of ways in which the union participation is important to loving cities has come up. And a second question that's come up a few times is really around how does this work around Loving Cities Index connect to the current conversation that we're having around school safety? So those are two questions that have come in, one about Janus and one about school safety.
Well, if I can start by saying, as we look at the domains and we talk about capacity, we know that through the partnership between communities and labor, they have been on the forefront of advocating for the equitable resources and supports that teachers need to teach for students to learn for decades now. And in fact, any effort that weakens the capacity of our educators and our labor movement to work with community in order to push for the resources that our young people deserve and the supports that our young people deserve is and should be taken as an offensive movement toward taking away the types of supports that young people need to have an opportunity to learn. So it's very important that in this climate where we're talking about safety, that our educators are not asking for legislators and others to give them and put in their hands weapons of mass destruction. What they are asking for, and they've been asking for, are loving supports. And in this effort, this is another call for the types of loving supports that are necessary in order to address the opportunity to learn for students. Again, we know, and the data shows, parental income has been the #1 predictor of student performance for a number of decades. And educators are charged not only with educating those students who come from the affluent backgrounds, but they're also charged with educating those students that are hurt. And as we saw in Parkland, Florida recently, hurt people will hurt people. And we want to ensure that our schools and our educators not only have a tool to push students out, because that's not what we want to do here, but the tools to provide the level of mental support, link young people with the level of mental supports and other supports that are necessary in order for them to have an opportunity to learn. So we hope that the Supreme Court sees it. We hope that the Supreme Court will stand behind the need and stand behind our educators and the need to strengthen their advocacy around support for young people, to build the capacity and the commitment for our young people. Because safety is not more metal detectors. It's not putting guns in the hands of young people. True safety is building the types of economic stability, socio-emotional stability in communities where people, regardless of where they come from, zip code, and regardless of their background, they can be hopeful and engaged in such a way where they see that they live in a loving city and a loving system.
Yeah, it's worth underscoring John's point that many of the Schott grantees and our partners who have been engaged in youth organizing for many, many years have, especially those young people of color, have been at the forefront of the movement around school safety and ending the school to prison pipeline. And that really starts with creating healthy living as well as healthy learning climates. And so it is young people and young people of color and parents of color who have really been talking about what it means to create a healthy learning environment, which has many of the components that we talk about in this report. And so, you know, credit where credit is due in terms of many of you being on the forefront of that movement. So it's great to have others join, but want to make sure that we highlight that a lot of you have been involved for a long time now. John, there's another question that I think is important to look at, which is examples of where this cross-sector collaboration is happening and how it can happen. So if you want to say a few words about that before we turn over to Allison and the data.
Sure. As Allison goes into the data and as we begin to talk about some of the bright spots, you know, you'll likely hear us talk about Buffalo and the work that's happening there through the Say Yes initiative. And our partners in Buffalo are the first to say that they are not where they want to be. But one of the things that is very inspirational is that they have been working at the table with various parts of the communities, from the mayor's office to K through 12 education, through higher education, through the family support agencies, to the legal support agencies, to parents. They are at the table and they are asking and answering the very difficult questions. One of the difficult questions that they're taking on now is, how do we provide more mental health supports to our young people? It's not anything that they pushed under the rug. They recognize that cities across the country need to take this on, but they put the question front and center, and they set as a goal to have in every school giving students access to mental health supports. So you'll hear about Buffalo and the work that they're doing there. Many of us are familiar with the work that has been happening in Cincinnati with Strive, and it's the only, I would say, district level community school model that we have to work from across the country. And the work in Long Beach and the community there, how they're working at a cross-sector table. So I think we've been in this mode where we're looking for these model programs. And I think it's less about finding model programs, but finding instances where individuals are sitting at the table, highlighting the things that are working, and those things that are not are in an honest discussion as loving partners on how do we get it right. There are definitely some examples. I gave you a few, and we hope to talk about some of the other pieces that are happening, even in some of the other cities that are still challenging to develop some of these supports.
Yeah, I'm glad, John, you highlighted Buffalo. Another thing I'll add about Buffalo is that part of why we're doing this work is to talk and speak to the sector of philanthropy where, you know, we sit. And part of it is about philanthropy helping to break down key silos. And again, the Community Foundation, the Greater Buffalo Community Foundation, in their work to create collaborative tables, really took a lead in actually creating something called the Racial Equity Roundtable, where racial equity and working towards racial justice is the centerpiece of that philanthropic endeavor. And so again, we in philanthropy have a lot we can do in terms of being leaders to break down these silos and create the kinds of collaborations that are going to really have to happen to get this work done. The other thing John highlighted was Cincinnati, and just, you know, that's a city that has done some out-of-the-box thinking. The local children's hospital, which is one of the leading children's hospitals in the nation, is really invested in being a partner with the Cincinnati Public Schools and has really taken on childhood health and sees education as a critical factor and indicator in childhood health. So they're a real partner in that work in Cincinnati. Lots more questions have been coming in, and so I'm going to jump to Allison Brown to talk about the data and finish going through our slides, and then we'll come back to your questions. Especially, we'll start with the questions as they are follow-ups to Allie and the data, and then launch into some of these other larger meta questions that many of you have. So thanks, John and Allie. Let me turn it to you.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And, you know, for those that have had a chance to go through the report, or when you do get a chance to go through the report, you'll see that the real goal is to introduce this framework that John's been talking about, to really explain what it means to be a loving city and the types of supports that we believe need to be in place. And so we have used these 10 cities to try and highlight where we see overall strengths, where we see challenges and bright spots from one city to the next. So basically what we've done is we wanted to find a way to assess the level of love in a system as at a whole. So we've looked at those 24 indicators that John walked through, and we basically set some parameters around what would this data point look like if a city was loving. And so with those kinds of benchmarks in place, we're able to apply a score across each of the 4 domains and overall for a city to be able to quantitatively share how well our city's doing in terms of providing the supports that we want to see. When we crunch those numbers, what we saw overall is that the 10 cities that we're looking at have between 34 to 52% of the supports that we'd want to see in place. So what, you know, again, what that tells us is we're really only about a third to a half of the way there in a lot of our major cities in terms of having the supports that are necessary for kids to have an opportunity to learn. And then we're also able to look by domain, and then you can see for individual cities as well as a whole, what are those areas where we're doing the best and what are those areas that are the most lagging. Overall, we saw that the care and stability, which as John highlighted, are the healthy living environment domains. Those we see about 50% on average of the supports. Of course, a little bit higher in some cities, a little bit lower in others. Commitment, we see a little bit higher than that. We, I think are seeing in several cities some examples of where good progress has been made on things like suspension and discipline policy, which I know a lot on the phone have really been leaders in that effort. And then perhaps not surprisingly, we see capacity as, generally the lowest of the domains in terms of the level of support there. And again, that's around the resourcing and experienced teachers and access to things like AP classes. So this snapshot here just gives us kind of a quick look at how cities are doing and kind of where they're relatively strong and where there's some of the biggest gaps in access. And then in the report, you'll see that we dive deeper, not only on each of the cities. So we have a profile in the report that you can see, which if we go to the next slide, I believe we'll see an example here. So here's an example of what you might see for a city like Philadelphia specifically. You see overall what the score is, and then this red, yellow, green really indicates how well did they do on the benchmarks that we set. So things that are red means that the city was really far off from the benchmark that we set. Things that are green means that they achieved the ideal benchmark, and yellow means they're kind of close but not quite there in terms of the ideal. So we show this to cities, and we have a little write-up in the city profiles around historical context on where the city has been, places where we're seeing progress, from conversations we've had with folks on the ground, as well as this data around where some of the biggest gaps are. But in addition to that, in the report, you'll see that we really want to break down each of those supports and really help folks understand even qualitatively where some of the gaps exist, even in terms of some of the data. I think one of our biggest takeaways from this entire experience was there was several data points we would have loved to have included in here and be able to have as part of the calculations of how loving a city is. And in a lot of cases, that data just doesn't exist. So, throughout the report, you'll see that we've highlighted where more is needed to understand how to deliver these supports. And we've also highlighted some of the calls to action from folks that really have expertise in each of these areas. So you'll see call out boxes that really dive a little bit deeper into things like affordable housing and community segregation, and trying to draw the connection to help show folks that don't live and breathe this information every day like many of you do, what the connection is between things like segregation in your community and graduation rates, and what some of the leading thinkers are saying around what's really needed. So again, just hope that everybody will be able to go through that and really see how we're trying to build the case around a lot of the things that many of you have been calling for many years now. Just to give you a little bit more of an insight into the data, these next few slides go through each domain, and you can see in these boxes with the red, yellow, green, just a little bit of a snapshot for how the 10 cities are doing overall. So overall, we see that things like prenatal services and health insurance across the 10 cities the access to those supports is pretty strong. And I think that is a testament for a lot of the collaborative work that's been done at local levels to improve those types of supports. And then we see some of the biggest gaps in food access and clean air and mental health services. And we really want to help show broader field that those things really are education issues. And so here you can see, just to give you an idea of what is the data that's behind the calculations, we're looking, for example, at in-school support staff, and what, we've set a benchmark for what we want to see, and cities like Buffalo and Little Rock have over 3 support staff per 100 students. So that gets them full points. You'll see Philadelphia has partial points, and Chicago at only 0.65. In-school support staff per students doesn't get points. And so again, this is, a tool to be able to go to leaders in Chicago and say, we really need to invest in things like in-school support staff in order to have the kinds of supports in place that all kids need to have the opportunity to learn. And similarly, you see that with food deserts. You can see kind of the spread across cities. Here you see that box around them in red. Actually, none of the 10 cities got full points for food access, though some, like Long Beach, are getting pretty close to the kind of level of food access that we'd want to see. So again, just some examples of some of the data that you'll see throughout the report. So here, again, looking at stability, I think this was an area where there's certainly still a lot of room for improvement. We looked at public transit, youth safety, and access to banking are things that we see kind of a spread across communities, some doing really well, some having really big gaps. And then things like affordable housing, livable wages, and civic participation as areas where we kind of see challenges across all 10 cities. And again, here you can kind of see the data points that we're using to assess that. Go to the next slide. So now we're moving, these are, commitment, and the next slide will be stability. So this is looking more at healthy learning environments. Still, we're trying to focus on those supports that are not necessarily what's in the classroom, but things that are really impacting the school climate and the kinds of climate that we would want students to have in order for them to feel like they're in a space where they can learn. And so we're looking at things like preschool suspension, as well as suspension for K through 12, and looking at expulsion, as well as school to prison alternatives. So 4 different kind of angles to look at the school to prison pipeline, and trying to kind of see how different communities are doing at reducing that kind of school to prison pipeline. And then we're also looking at things like anti-bullying and access to early childhood education as indicators of the level of commitment that cities have. And again, you can see some of the data points here that we're looking at to assess some of these things. And then lastly, capacity. Again, seeing the most gaps here in terms of the 4 domains. We are looking at K-8 gifted curriculum, as well as high school advanced curriculum. So that's AP and IB classes. And then we're looking at the experience of teachers in schools, how economically integrated schools are, and how well-resourced schools are. And something I didn't say before, but I'll pause here to kind of show, is that we're not only scoring the overall, so you can see in this chart on AB, IB participation, that blue bar is looking at the total level of participation in AP and IB classes for students in those cities. So we're scoring that number, but we're also looking at the difference between Black, Hispanic, and white student outcomes. And we're also providing a quantitative score that looks at how equitable outcomes are. So, you can see in this example, Chicago at 35% of students participating in AB and IB. That's fairly strong. Looking at the data, we looked at that earned some partial points for overall. But the fact that there's an over 25-point spread between outcomes for participation rates for Black students versus white students, there would be no points awarded there for equity. So I just want to underscore that that the methodology behind this framework is really focused on equity, and we really prioritize trying to use data points that would allow us to disaggregate by race, so that we're looking at not only the supports that are needed for the opportunity to learn, but what's the level of equity in access to those supports. So I'll pause there, but happy to take any questions on methodology, data, or anything else that's top of mind for folks.
So one question that's come in about the data, Allie, is around how we measured school resource capacity. So maybe you want to start there, and then maybe also talk a little bit about our challenges around finding uniform data across the 10 cities.
Absolutely, yeah, and this is a great example of that. So ideally, we would have wanted here to actually look at the total level of resourcing, per student, to be able to compare. When we looked at the data, we found that the cities compile both resources towards charter schools and public schools. So it was hard for us to find a data point that we felt like was really reflective of the level of resourcing from public schools in one city to the next. So what after speaking with some experts in the field, we found that you can use teacher salary as a proxy for school resourcing, and it's a little bit more of an accurate look at how cities are spending their resources and the equitability of the spending. So that's what we've used here, but certainly our hope is that down the line we can kind of look at this in a little bit of a different way. But to Cassie's point, we did just, at a higher level, when we were thinking about the data points that we could use for each of these indicators, there was several points that we would have loved to use, but they are not collected at the local level in the exact same way from one city to the next. So we really tried to, we really only used publicly available resources that reported on data from one city to the next in a very consistent way, so that we were really comparing apples to apples from one city to the next. And as you can imagine, with things where population levels are really different, we were trying to look at population level outcomes and percentages, so that again we can compare apples to apples. It's not just about who has more, but about the percentage of access that's available.
So I'll also add that school finance is obviously a very important issue for the Schott Foundation. We've focused on it for our 25 years. There's a new report that Education Law Center issues every year in collaboration with Rutgers University, looking at specifically state capacity to provide equitable school finance. And so going to Education Law Center's website is one place to learn more about this. But to Allie's point, just in terms of comparing apples to apples, we know that a lot of you in your different cities, whether it's one of these 10 cities or not, has done research and has been involved in whether it's litigation or other equity campaigns. And so we would love to be able to highlight your work through the Loving Cities website. If you work in one of these 10 cities and there's some equity issues around school finance, maybe it's a litigation piece, maybe something else, we want to keep that website. While data can sometimes get old, we want to really commit to this larger community to keep the website updated, so that as there's new stories and information out about capacity of schools to deliver resources that we know are critical to creating healthy learning environments, please let us know, contact us. We'll have a slide at the end that will give you some information how to contact us so that we can keep that website updated. As I'm looking for more questions related to the data, John, there's a couple questions that I think are big picture questions that you can tackle. One question was, how did we choose the 10 cities? And another question that's come in is really about asking how is this relevant? We live in rural America. How is the Loving Cities framework relevant to rural schools and rural communities? So I'm going to keep checking questions for data, but I thought I'd let you tackle those questions, John.
Okay, I'll take the second question first. I think it's very relevant to rural communities in some sense, even more than urban communities because of the proximity of many of the rural communities. If we believe that these supports are necessary, access to healthy food, access to public transit, then we've got to think through what are the best platforms to provide these supports. And what we contend is, as the only mandatory network of institutions, the public education system is the perfect platform to begin to attach the necessary support to address the larger opportunity gaps. And no, we're not saying that teachers should take on finding livable wage jobs for family members or should take on providing mental health supports. Not at all, because we believe that teachers are doing much more than they should be required to do at this point. But what is necessary is that we align these supports with the school so that the school serves as a platform to begin to address many of the opportunity gaps that confront these young people and their families. So as we talk about rural America, I would say that those philanthropic partners and those advocacy partners that have in your footprint rural communities, even more, we want to make sure that there is an assessment done on those communities to identify the supports that are available and those that are not. So collectively, the community can begin to think through how to align, working with the school district, how to align those supports. And as I mentioned, we selected the 10 cities that we have because many of the cities are working in a cross-sector, already have a cross-sector table that they're working through, like Buffalo and Long Beach. And then several of the other cities, because of their political relevance, it's important that we nudge them to do so. To the degree that we're not seeing the outcomes that we would like to see in a city like Chicago or Philadelphia, it's important that advocates and parents have the ability to assess what supports are there and what supports are missing. To the degree that there's something that's happening in those places, like in Baltimore, where advocates and have worked to improve some of the outcomes relative to out-of-school suspension, those things should be highlighted because they offer for us a model to address a very serious challenge. So we try to mix the cities that are working through a cross-sector table with those cities that need a nudge. And ultimately, we want the cities to be able to do two things. Number one, highlight what's working. And number two, in the areas where there's more need, issue a call to action. And a call to action in such a way that it's not just educators and parents and students who are charged to meet that call, but it's also the larger city, larger community, mayors, county officials, and others who are charged to meet the call of providing all students an opportunity to learn.
Great. A couple questions have come in about teacher capacity and teacher experience. John, and I think you know, a lot of our grantees have been working on culturally responsive education programs and the issue of the dearth of teachers of color. And so how do we, the question is, how is Schott understanding the need for experienced teachers balanced with the need for more teachers of color in our classrooms? So if you want to speak to that in terms of the healthy learning environments, as well as perhaps addressing issues of implicit bias.
Yeah, so I mentioned in my opening comments that A lot of what we're dealing with are local policies and practices that for decades baked into their system, at best implicit bias, and at worst policies that promote racism and hate. And part of what we have to definitely address to build a healthy learning environment are those policies and practice that have baked into them implicit bias that produce disparate outcomes based on race. Allison mentioned that in our data collection, we had to find data points that were applicable to each of the cities across the country. So at a high level, experienced teachers is that data point. Now, I mentioned that we welcome localities to take this a step further. We know that being an experienced teacher also requires some level of cultural competence. See, it requires that we have a teaching core that is able to connect with the communities, the students, and the parents as well. So for those communities where they are not performing well, or as well as they would like to around this experienced teacher indicator, it's an opportunity to even further underscore the need to address the diversity within the teaching core and to address the need for culturally competent teachers within the core. It's also important that it's used as an opportunity to address the implicit bias that are leading to these outcomes, because any outcome that we identify by race or ethnicity is not a normal outcome. That outcome only exists because there is a policy and practice that is in place that has an implicit bias built into it. And what do I mean by that? We should not be able to tell by race or ethnicity who's more likely to graduate, who's less likely to be in gifted and talented courses. That is an unusual outcome, and there's an implicit bias that's built into that policy of practice. So we wanted to use this as an opportunity to provide a national, in many respects, a national framework, but also at a local level, an opportunity to elevate some of the issues that are important to continue to elevate in order to provide the supports and build the types of partnerships that are necessary to address the issues.
I'm going to ask again, if you have questions specific to the data, please feel free to write those into the chat box or put those in the hashtag grassrootsed. A few people have asked this question, John, about you know, as school budgets are getting reduced and we see less money, fewer resources going into actually funding schools, what can cities do at the governmental level to actually create more resources for what the kinds of supports we're talking about?
Yeah, and this is another reason why we thought it was important that we publish this cross-sector approach. Because while we all know that there is a need for more of a commitment at the state level and definitely at the federal level to our young people, it's also important that assessment happens in looking at between the agencies within your city, whether it's housing, whether it's labor and education. Where are the redundancies and where are there dollars that are not reaching families and reaching young people? I know that this is something that Buffalo, they did and they continue to do in assessing how can they streamline those supports that are intended for young people and families that are found in different buckets and portfolios across the city government in such a way where they reach the young people in a meaningful way. So part of this, yes, is identifying where there are the redundancies and how do we do more with the money that we have. The other part of it is how do we set up a better framework for states and the federal government to better support localities. Heretofore, for the last couple of decades, the federal government's role in helping localities has primarily been around assessment, standard, and accountability. And while those are very important, they're still insufficient to address the types of supports that are needed. So what we're trying to build here is a framework that would even shift the relationship that the federal government has with states in identifying how to deliver those supports to cities, those cross-sector supports. What is the relationship between the Department of Labor, the relationship between Health and Human Services, and definitely the Department of Education and Commerce? How do they channel those supports in such a way where they make a larger impact? And finally, this is also relevant for philanthropy. Schott is a philanthropic organization, and within the philanthropic sector, for far too long, we've worked collectively in silos. And this is as much as a call to action to the philanthropic sector as it is the public sector, that our siloed approach won't get us where we need to be in order to provide each and every child access to a loving system from birth.
Thanks, John. So there's a couple questions that are coming in about how this is playing at the local level. So all of the 10 cities that are in the index, we have designed, we are working with Spitfire Communications, and all of the 10 cities and leadership in those 10 cities, but also the local press in those 10 cities have received a local press release about this. So we are working on getting coverage in each of those 10 cities as well as national outlets. If you are located in one of those 10 cities and you want to elevate your issues that you've been working on, and we think that many of what you're working on in your organizing advocacy efforts are connected to this frame around healthy living and healthy learning environments, we definitely invite you to contact the editorial board, write a letter to the editor, or even submit your own op-ed, and feel free to contact us and see if we can help you with that, depending on how many requests we get. If 100 of you want us to help write op-eds, we probably can't do that, but if 10 of you do, we certainly can. So let us know if there's a way that we can support your efforts to connect this work to your local work. Also, the website, the lovingcities.org website, has a lot more information and will be continually updated. So feel free to look at some of that local information if it helps to tell your local story. John, there's another question that's come in around civic participation and the fact that we use civic participation as a thermostat indicator. It's really a two-part question that I'm gonna phrase it as a two-part question. Why is that part of our Healthy Cities framework, civic participation? But also, what do you do when the folks who turn out to vote for a local school board, for example, are white parents? How do we ensure the racial diversity and racial makeup of a district to stay true to the leadership at the school board and local election level? So I'll put it that way if you want to take those.
Well, we included it because it's a fact that having low voter turnout is an education issue, that there's something about the social capital that exists or does not exist, or in political capital that exists or does not exist within a city that has low voter turnout. And the goal here is not to suppress any voters, but to increase the access for all voters to participate in our political process and thereby make their feelings and sentiments felt within elections. And as we know, I don't have to tell you, elections have consequences or they present opportunities. So we thought that it was important to boldly state that if you're living in a city with low voter turnout, it's making it more difficult to address many of the opportunity gaps and the challenges that we see. And again, heretofore, we haven't always heard it articulated in that way. The second way it matters is to the degree that we're able to provide these supports to young people in our public school system. Our public school system educates over 90% of Americans and immigrants in America. And we have seen over the last several years the impact that public school students can make and have made. It was public school students in the instances in the 50s and 60s where racial segregation, it was public school students who were walking out of schools. It was public school students who more recently issued the call to say that Black Lives Matters. It's public school students who are part of the Dreamers movement who remind us that America's unique ability is not in our ability to build walls, but our ability to provide opportunity for diverse people. And definitely right now, it's public school students in Parkland, Florida, and across Florida who are marching to Tallahassee and marching to DC to send the message and remind America we don't need more weapons of mass destruction, but in fact, we need loving systems. So civic engagement not only benefits those who participate in the political process, but also it creates more civically engaged individuals. And our public school system is the emblematic expression of why civic engagement is very important.
Absolutely. And I also should highlight, there's a lot of questions about local participation beyond civic engagement. How do students, how do parents participate? So a couple things on that. One is, for those of you asking questions about that, there's probably some form of education justice organizing going on in your city or locality. We can highlight several national coalitions that we are part of and support. The Dignity in Schools campaign, if you go to their website, you can just Google these campaigns. Dignity in Schools campaign, they have partners across the country working to end school to prison pipeline, creating healthy school learning environments for all kids, as well as for teachers and other personnel within the school building. So that's Dignity in Schools campaign. There's also the Journey for Justice campaign, working on a number of these issues. And they've led the hashtag We Choose work. And so you can look at their website to find out what cities they're involved in. And then there's also the Alliance to Reclaim Our Schools. That is a community labor partnership between the teachers unions and several national organizing entities working on education justice. And they work in several cities as well across the country. So whether you're in one of these 10 cities or not, there's ways that you can be involved in this work at the local level. And then there's also ways that you can continue to elevate this framework around loving cities and whole child supports in lots of different ways. As John said, really, we've spent the last many years in this country talking about standard-based education reform. And you have to pause and wonder if we had spent 30 years talking about supports-based education and how we can really support our students and teachers and others in the learning community, how we would have done that, what the results and the outcomes would look like right now. So again, promoting this notion of supports-based education nationally is an important part of this work as well. If you want to keep the conversation going, we're at Schott Foundation or at Schott Found. You can go and tweet about the hashtag Loving Cities. And also we want to really encourage you, we're going to be working on other materials around this work to connect the work that you're doing and this work, like creating the parent and student checklist about what to look for if you want to make sure that you have a healthy learning environment in your school and in your community, and ways you can plug in with other campaigns like Fight for 15 or around immigration reform, ways that you can connect the healthy community part of the work to your local on the ground organizing efforts. So we are creating these parent and student school board checklists. We would love your participation. A lot of you have been working on similar topics and working with students and parents. If there's ways that you want to offer your support in those materials, maybe be a focus group for us. We want to make sure that we're really building it around your expertise and your lived experience as we go out and put those materials into the Loving Cities framework. So with that, I think we're at time, and I really want to thank everyone for participating in the webinar, but really thank everyone for participating in making each and every child have the opportunity to learn, to close the opportunity gaps that are so pervasive throughout our systems, and really ending policies of hate and racism and creating policies of love and loving systems. So lots of you are doing that in your own ways, and we just want to thank each and every one of you and encourage you to stay connected in this work in the future. So thank you, and I'll say good afternoon.
Take care.